So what you see here is me putting up a series of pieces of paper on the wall. So when we got to mid-March last year, and every day it felt like there was some dramatic new news in our world, and things were getting more dire by the hour. And suddenly my son came home from college, all of my students went home from college, we all transitioned to teaching online, and my daughters were also then schooling from home in this sort of what felt like an extended spring break period that never really recovered, that sort of just weirdly transitioned into summer. I think probably many of you could identify with the feeling that it was a really disorienting time period, especially that middle of March into early April, when we we're supposed to be sheltering in place and not quite sure how long this will last or what's coming next. And so one thing I decided to do as a way to sort of mark the time for myself was to start a daily practice that I thought, well, I'll just do this during this pandemic, which is to write one letter a day. I've been a letter writer, I would say, pretty much all my life, in different forms and with different people. And I have a variety of kind of periodic ongoing correspondences with friends in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, sort of intermittent, not like hasn't been a constant thing, but just sort of every so often a letter comes or a letter goes out, sort of the way of letters like that. But I thought in middle of March, I thought, I'd really like to make this an intentional. I'd never had daily practice before. And so I thought this would be something that I would find grounding for me in this disorienting time. And it would also, I thought, be a way to reach out to somebody every day to try to maintain a connection with someone somewhere in a time when we're not supposed to be together. And so sometimes I was writing to people, who live in my town, and other times it was for people who live very far away. And I was also, sort of along with this, I decided to write these letters on pieces of paper that I had marbled by hand. So they're all on marbled paper. So it's a little bit of art in the mail, maybe a little nice mail art surprise that you get when you open up the envelope. And I did this because right before things shut down, I had been fortunate to host a friend of mine, a visiting artist named Aisha Durrani from Pakistan. And one of the things that she had done with my students and me at Bethel College was to teach us her form of paper marbling that she uses with her students at the National College of Arts in Rawalpindi. And so she had just left in this sort of chaotic time, managed to get back home in the midst of everything. And then I had this huge pile of paper that I had marbled with her, and that I felt, really, really good about this close relationship we had had, and the fact that she'd been able to come halfway across the world to visit and to work with my students and speak to the Bethel College audience. So I thought, okay, I will use this paper to marble, or I use this marbled paper to write the letters that I will send out every day. And so every day when I write a letter, I will say I had no idea how long I would be writing letters. Today is day, I think, 276. So, it's gone on longer than I might have anticipated, but it's been a really good kind of, sorry, I'll be advancing the images here as I go. It's been a really good kind of daily practice, since I haven't had one before, to sort of see the ebbs and flows of how that works. And I don't keep documentation of the letters. Initially, I thought, well, maybe I should take a letter or a photograph of this letter that I'm writing, but then that felt sort of weird. I don't know, like a form of surveillance almost of myself and the other person. So I do take a photo of the marbling because they're really beautiful papers. And so I take a photo of those, and I do have a list of who I've written to each day, just sort of for my own, curiosity, maybe future down the road. I'd like to know who I wrote to when. But otherwise, I don't keep record of it because I feel like the artwork sort of goes out that way, out into the world. It's not like they're ever going to be collected again. But when I knew I had the show coming up at the Art Center, I thought I'd like to have some sort of data visualization, some representation on the walls of this project, because it's been a really important part of my 2020. So because I have continued to marble paper all through the summer and fall, I thought it would make sense for me and for the project if the visualization incorporated marbled paper. So what I did was to cut, let's see, I'll see if I can get to a close up here. I decided to cut, so to do a bunch of freeform paper cutting, which is something I do in my printmaking practice often, freeform paper cut stencils for monotypes and other kinds of prints. So I did a lot of paper cutting with these marbled papers in sort of, I don't know, what I would consider kind of vines, roots, sort of organic shapes. Not really planned out, but then assembled them in sort of a organic pattern on the wall, which is what you see here, this installation starting to take shape. Yeah, okay, I'll go back this way. And so they all come out, you see there's a writing desk there at the bottom. So it's the representation of letters that I'm writing each day, and maybe a visual representation of the kinds of connections that I've maintained through this time, and that I hope also continue in a sort of organic way. Maybe not only, maybe some people write back to me, they do sometimes, but maybe they also write letters to other people. So here's a closer to finished view of what this looks like. And you can sort of imagine those like fingers or tendrils or vines sort of snaking out, some intersecting and some just sort of going their own directions, which I think is a good representation of human connections in a lot of ways. The ways that we connect or we overlap or intersect. And so, yeah, so I wanted a representation of that. Interestingly, I think everybody sort of sees their own thing in something that's kind of abstract like this. When I did a virtual tour with one person, and she lives somewhere where there's a lot of water, and so she immediately saw estuaries, rivers, creeks, streams flowing and sort of moving across the wall, which I think could also be a totally valid interpretation. Also, what you see there on the desk are it's some stationery that I've created for this installation. It's called "Hoping You Are Well" stationery, and anybody who comes to visit the space or writes, I send them some of the stationery back with the hopes that they too might choose to write a letter to someone as a way of maintaining connection during this time. So that is one of the projects that is in the space, is that one. What mainly takes up the space are what you see here in the windows. They are tea towels on which I have embroidered words. That's what a lot of these photographs will show you. This project is called Taking Care, and it's a project that I began in 2018. And the idea is, again, it has to do with letters. And I don't know, I think it comes out a lot of sort of longstanding concerns of mine about caring labors. Who does the work of caring? Historically, it's been more one gender than another. Certainly that has changed, I think, over time in some ways. But caring labors are often also things that are not seen publicly, that are not necessarily made visible, not always valued very highly. And so, for a lot of these reasons, this was a project I wanted to focus on care and letters, because I think I really see letters as a way of caring for each other through correspondence, through taking the time to care for each other with our words in a sort of parallel way that we take time when we are caring for people, physically in the home or in other places. And so it's a participatory project, Taking Care, where people are invited to write letters in which they recount a time when they felt cared for by another person. And this could be something, a large act, or it could be just a small gesture. Many people write about a family member, but sometimes the letters have to do with something done by a total stranger that really stood out to that person. And so what I do when I receive these letters, obviously read them, and then I spend time with the letters thinking about what are the words in this letter that really kind of capture the essence of the story. And those are the words that I choose to make visible. Partly for privacy's sake, I'm not interested in displaying the whole letter, someone's whole story, because sometimes they're pretty intimate. But obviously by participating, they're giving me permission to share some of that story. And so I also try to choose words that I think will allow people in to the story in some way. So, not giving all the details, maybe leaving it a little bit vague, so that people can imagine themselves maybe as part of that. You'll see that they have different scripts on them. Many of them are in cursive, not all. Some are not in cursive. Some are in small caps. And so it's a variety of handwritings. And that's an intentional choice on my part to try to emulate. Most of the letters I receive are handwritten. And so when they are, I try to really emulate the handwriting of the letter writer. And that means that I'm spending time also sort of prior to the embroidery of the words, practicing the letter writing, practicing in that person's script, because I feel like that really helps me get to know the person a little bit, whether or not I ever meet them. I feel like it's an intentional time where I'm getting to know them in a way, and it's a way of listening to their story, I think, for me, of carefully tracing, or not tracing, but sort of carefully writing some of the, especially in cursive, everybody sort of has their own ways of making different letters. And so, yeah, so I do some practicing with that before then writing it onto the T-tells. And then I spend time, hours, embroidering these stories, which I really consider a sustained form of listening. So I started this project, like I said, in 2018. And it's been what I would consider an episodic kind of project where it's happened twice a year in the years since then. So twice in 2018 and 2019. Really sort of just once in 2020 because the plans I had for a residency in May, of course, got postponed significantly. That one's been rescheduled for 2022. So we'll see if it's this project or another that I'd take on by then. Although I did a lot of embroidery in isolation in March and April too, so maybe that's the other sort of half of this. But generally, when I've worked on this project, it's been in this kind of residency format where I have days that I'm really dedicating to doing this, and it's really a durational act where it becomes a very physical kind of labor. Embroidery, is maybe wearing on the fingers and the eyes to begin with, but I really notice after sitting in a chair for 4 or 5 or 6 hours embroidering how physical that becomes, which for me also is a good representation or a good kind of metaphor for the ways that the physical toll sometimes that caregiving can take. So that is what primarily you see when you come to the gallery are some of these texts that even from hopefully across the way you can, whether you're looking in from the outside or looking in from the doorway, hopefully you can read some of these texts. I should say that if you come to the gallery, you won't be able to come into the space. I don't know if that's been made, I think that's been made clear in the Art Center literature about this. But for me too, that's an act of care as a way of, isolating myself from other people. We're caring for each other by staying home or by keeping our distance. So, as much as I would like to have conversations with people, in a gallery setting like I've done in past iterations of this, it happens virtually now or in different ways. The third project that's in the space, there's not a lot to see. Oh, this is the view that you would get from the doorway when you come in. The third project is an audio recording. It's called Letters to the Future. And it's an entirely text-based piece that is, it's just on an audio loop in the space. So again, there's nothing to see in the images here of that. But it's a series of letters I've been writing, sort of epistolary poems that have to do with things I read and sort of imagined future readers of these letters and imagined futures as we think about caregiving and different models of living that might be more sustainable in future times. So that's what's on the audio. So that's the third piece there. So I've talked for like 20 minutes here. Maybe it's a good time to open it up for some questions for anybody who might have questions, anything I didn't explain well about the pieces or anything you might want to know a little more about. I'll just keep going through images as we do that. I don't think I can see the chat at this point, so if Gretchen or somebody else wants to chime in.
We do have a couple questions coming in the chat. And again, if you're watching on Facebook Live, I encourage you to please post your questions in the comments and they will get to us. So the first question is, can you say more about how and what you learn and what you have learned through tracing one's handwriting? And then the comment is interesting and provocative, this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been interested in different forms of handwriting for a lot of years. You know, I think back even to high school and earlier. If I would go back and look at some of my writing from junior high school, and college, I might not even notice that it's my own writing, because like I remember intentional times in my life where I decided to change how I was going to write. You know, it said something about, like, I was going to decide to make a letter in a different way. You know, or change entirely. I went through a long period of writing in all small caps. You know, I think it has to do with different stages you go through in life, I think, you know, wanting to identify yourself in different ways. You know, but I think for a lot of people, cursive, script, you know, you learn it a certain way, or when people learned it, it was in a certain way. I'm also an art historian, and so I've spent time in archives working with artists' handwriting. From the one case I'm thinking of is an artist who lived in Berlin about 100 years ago, and trying to decipher the things that she had written, not only in another language, but also in a very different kind of cursive than the kind that I learned when I was young. You know, I felt like I really got to know her after a while of figuring out how she made certain letters, and just got a little bit of a glimpse into, I don't know, sort of the physicality of her. I really see letters and handwriting as these very kind of physical remnants of our bodies, which I think when people sit down to write a handwritten letter today is maybe more noticeable than it might have been, say, 100 years ago, because we don't do it as often. And so I have had people who write back to me in the pandemic project where, you know, they really notice their hand cramps, or their hands are not used to doing this kind of longhand writing, because we so often type, text, call, etc., that we don't use these sort of very physical actions that we once did. Hopefully that answers that a little bit, but if you have a follow-up question, please feel free to ask.
All right, I have another question. Overall, has this project felt like you expected since before you began? How did your expectations change for the experiences or outcomes once the pandemic set in? And I think this is a good question, because I know we had a lot of conversations about this.
And Gretchen, do you think this is about the daily letters or about the taking care? Oh, you're muted now.
Sorry.
That's
I think
right.
you could maybe relate it to both.
Right, yeah, okay. I mean, maybe I'll talk first in terms of the daily letters. I think I went in, you know, probably a little naively. You know, I do remember thinking, I wonder how long this will last. Maybe I'm getting in, you know, biting off more than I can chew. And certainly I think it has lasted longer than many of us expected that it would. Although not everybody. Some people, you know, had a good sense, I think, right from the start that this is going to be, we're in it for the long haul. But it's been really good for me to experience the durational nature of a daily practice. You know, and writing a letter is not, and it's not like it's a huge time commitment. You know, or it's not an overly physically taxing kind of thing, but when you know that you are doing it every day, and it's not like there's anybody forcing me to do it every day. I could take a day off, I could stop. But when you sort of have it in your mindset that you're going to do this every day, sort of like exercise, if you decide you're going to do it every day, then you have made this decision and you feel some obligation to continue. And so it's been interesting for me to see the sort of the cycle, the ebbs and flows of when it's very life-giving and I get a lot of energy from it. And then, there've been times this fall when I was, juggling in-person teaching, online teaching, a lot of other things. And, then it's making time to fit it in, which doesn't feel as good as if when you're sheltering in place and have all this time at home, teaching from home exclusively, and it feels like a really good mode of connection. So yeah, there have definitely been some cycles to it where I've had to have a different mindset at different times for it to still feel meaningful like I want it to. With the Taking Care project, yeah, I mean, it has felt different, certainly in the pandemic. I did a little bit of the embroidery, especially in April and into May, when I felt like I could give it sustained attention. That's been part of the reason that I do this episodically in sort of residency formats, because part of my goal here is to really listen to the stories that people are sharing with me, to listen to them by reading, by tracing the words or practicing the script, and to listen by embroidering, by taking a long time to embroider some of those words. And it's not the kind of thing that I want to fit in around other things, whether that's teaching or caring for family or doing dishes or whatever, that I want to really set aside the time, set aside hours over a period of days to really spend with these stories. So that's been an intentional choice on my part, that while I did do a little bit of it in spring when the other residency got canceled, when I felt like I had hours to devote to it, yeah, I didn't continue that. I think once sort of things opened up in a different way again, and yeah, just because I didn't feel like I had the same amount of sort of sustained hours that I wanted to devote to it. So yeah, so I sort of paused on that until I could be in the residency here. Other questions?
All right, I have another question about the embroidery.
Yes.
You mentioned that embroidering is a sustained form of listening. So curious if what you hear is through your fingertips and something from your consciousness, or something that you feel is being transferred from the consciousness of the original letter writer.
I don't know, I suppose it could be some of both. Yeah, and I think there's certainly a lot of imagination involved too, especially if I don't know the person who has written the letter, then, it depends on how much detail they include. If I can visualize the story that's been shared, or if it's kind of vague, then there's a lot of room for me to imagine how that might have happened, who these people might have been. Although I've found for the most part, people really share a lot of details that are often about pretty intimate moments. And so, yeah, so there's maybe less room for imagining there and more just room for sitting with what's been conveyed, which, yeah, maybe that the more detail there is, maybe the more connection there is to that other person's consciousness. That's a really interesting question.
All right, one more question. When you write to a person, do you tell them that they are part of this project?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Sometimes, I think I did more early on when I had just started, especially if I was reaching out to somebody that I maybe hadn't communicated with in quite a long time. A little bit as a little bit of an explanation of this is what I'm doing while we're, in this weird time. But I don't know, I think the longer it's gone on, I mean, and often in many of the cases they have become correspondences if they weren't already. And so they're, when people write back and then I write back to them, I don't have to explain in the same way. But even for people who haven't written back, like I don't always explain, I guess, that it's part of a project. Because it's still, even if it's like I just sent a condolence card to somebody after the death of her father, and I didn't feel like it was really necessary in that case to say this is also part of an art project that I'm doing every day, because I think it's a standalone thing on its own as well. And I have written some letters to senators and representatives during this time also. So, and I don't feel like I need to tell them it's an art project as well as a political plea in some cases.
All right, and another reminder again, if you're watching or listening, you can submit your questions through the Facebook comments and we will get them here. Rachel, I was wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit on the tea towels and is an object in particular, which I find kind of fascinating. And I was having a conversation recently with someone about how, like, when I got married, my grandmas gave me embroidered tea towels, and they became these like precious objects that I would not use because my grandmas made them, but yet they're tea towels. In this kind of really interesting place, where they're supposed to be utilitarian, but I just couldn't see them that way. But they also seem to kind of really reflect like paper and something that really fits the written word. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that choice of material.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I certainly resonate with a lot of those associations that you've made. I have, tea towels that my mother has made. I had some that my father made that, and both of which we've used. And, now that my father has passed away, I sort of regret having used them because the ones we still have are in tatters because they've been so used. I think we still have some that my mother-in-law made, gave us when we got married. So yeah, lots of family associations for that. But for these, beautiful but yet very utilitarian objects. And so some of that, I think, for me is wrapped up in the choice to use tea towels for these, that they're often, I think they're a marker of all kinds of things. The sort of historical desire to beautify utilitarian objects, to use your creativity in a very practical way, maybe in some cases seen as more like socially acceptable than if you're just being creative for the sake of being creative, as long as it's to the end of being used in a practical way, then it maybe had a little more excuse or purpose in that way. I think for me, it's also tied up in this idea of care. Somebody asked me if these were diapers that I was embroidering on, and I said no, but I can, I think that would in some ways have a similar connotation. The idea that these are objects that we use in our daily life as part of caring labors for the people around us, So I think there's a variety of associations there, but some intentional choices.
All right, can you tell us, excuse me, what was I going to say? A little bit more about like what you think about, where this project's going to go after you're done with your residency here, and some of your thoughts for the future.
Yeah, let's see. So the residency that got rescheduled from May is now scheduled to happen in 2022. So if this project, I guess my sort of initial thought for this is that, at least with the taking care with the tea towels, that will be maybe a 5-year project. I don't know, that's not like set in stone, but it's sort of my thought right now. If I do sort of more or less 2 residencies a year of short-term periods, we'll see if I sort of stick with that or not. But that's sort of my thought right now, to make it a 5 or so year project. the pandemic letters, you know, once day 100 came and went, and I kind of thought, well, I guess we're just going. At this point, I'm sort of thinking the 1 year mark sounds like a good stopping point. Not that I'll stop writing letters. Certainly, I have lots of correspondences, even more so now than I used to. But the daily aspect may taper off after the 1 year mark. You know, also now that people are actually getting vaccinated, there is an eventual light at the end of the tunnel and sort of an eventual ending point. So we'll see. The 1 year mark may be the kind of place where I stop doing it on a daily basis. It's my thought right now, but you know, we'll see.
I was going to ask before, and I forgot a little, if you could talk a little bit more about how you, and I think you mentioned this in the curator talk a little bit about how you kind of were introduced to embroidery, maybe how you learned how to do it, or when that started becoming part of what you usually regularly used in your artistic practice.
Yeah, you know, I don't know that I really remember when I actually first learned to embroider. I think probably in childhood at some point. I've always been a maker of different kinds, and I come from a long line of makers in the family who did lots of things. So I think when it really kind of came into my artistic practice was a couple of years ago, 2017, 2018. Part of it has to do with okay, so I should back up a little bit on that. I worked even probably 10 or more years ago with embroidery floss, but not on fabric. One thing I've done is to use embroidery floss on paper. The first time I did this, I found it incredibly satisfying to stitch on paper. I don't know why that was, but as I got more into artist books, making and teaching those with my students, I really found that was a great, I really appreciated that form of stitching through different kinds of really fibrous papers. In terms of the embroidery on fabric, you know, this project really, I think for me, comes a lot out of having gone back to school. As Gretchen mentioned at the beginning, I'm an art historian as well as a visual artist. I went sort of the art history route the first time, but also had a making practice kind of on the side, but I'd always thought eventually that I would go back to school for an MFA, which I eventually did in 2016. I went back to school. And I think part of it, for me, part of that desire was to find a way to unite these disparate parts, or what felt like these disparate parts of my own practice, the writing and research and the making. And for me, finding a way to unify those, you know, I think in some ways there'd been lots of overlaps to begin with, but finding a way to unify them in my own practice and maybe in my head as well was really helpful. And some of that happened through projects like this that really incorporate text. And then embroidery has been, I've made it part of my teaching practice as well. For me, it's been a great way to see. I'm gonna exit this slideshow because I think we're at the end of the slides here. Go back to the beginning, maybe. So I now incorporate an embroidery project in one of my foundations classes, partly because I think it's a really good life skill for students to know how to thread a needle and to do some very basic stitching with it. Although some students really take off and get pretty into the idea of stitching and embroidery, you know, but even if they don't, if they know how to thread a needle and fix a hole in their sock and, you know, use a needle and thread, it's a kind of sharing of knowledge from our hands. I think that maybe it's a skill from the past that I think can still be useful in the present. So I've appreciated sharing that with students and seeing the ways that some of them get very excited about these, what they consider sort of old-fashioned practices.
I have a quick question in the chat. Could you repeat the third project that you mentioned, the audio one? Yeah, if you want to talk a little bit more about that piece.
Yeah, so it's a series of letters. They're called Letters to the Future, epistolary poems that I've written. And they're based on things that I read often when I read, I write down passages, turns of phrase, ideas that appeal to me. And then all of these poems that I've written have to do with the themes and the things that I've been reading, sort of setting them in conversation with each other, often very disparate kinds of readings. And then, sort of like I'm always thinking about audience as well, like who am I speaking to? And for me, that's very much an imagined future reader, as we sort of, in these difficult times, as we imagine how we might do things differently for a more sustainable future, for our children, for our grandchildren, what kinds of choices might we make differently, not just like big scale about the planet, but also, small scale in the ways that we do things day to day. So those are some of the kinds of themes of caregiving, sharing of knowledge in different ways that come through. You can see, so back here behind me in this installation, there's a little speaker on the pedestal. That's where that audio lives. So if you come to the door of the gallery, you can hear the text being read. And I had the recordings are voiced by different friends of mine in different parts of the world. And so each of them has, there are a few who live in the US, but most of them have accents from a variety of places. And that too was a really intentional choice on my part, not to be speaking at all myself, but to be having it in a variety of voices of people who are close to me, but also of people who sound different from each other, as a way to, I think, maybe help us think about the commonalities that we share across geographic borders and boundaries, and across the ways that the similarities and differences in the ways that we care for other people, no matter where we live or what our social context might be. So that's a little more about that project.
All right, I had one last question that maybe was a little bit broad. But I really, I enjoy the fact that you incorporate so much written language into your work, which I feel like can be really difficult when you are combining written language with visual language and they don't always connect. And it's just such a huge part of your practice. Can you talk a little bit about, have you ever struggled with that, or how do you kind of make these two languages work together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's interesting to sort of look back at my own practice and my own teaching to see the ways that I think I have struggled with that too. And still today especially in lower level studio classes, I really discourage students in a lot of cases from using any kind of text, because I think far too often we feel more comfortable with a written word than we do with our own artistic skills, whether it's a student or professional artist, or, that I've never wanted to over rely on the word if I'm trying to convey something visual. And so really, conveying to students that if you are making a drawing about, that's on the theme of love, you don't need to have the word love there. You need to show us rather than tell us. But I also have this writing practice. I'm a researcher and a historian, as well as a creative writer. And so, wanting to find some ways to use text in my work has sort of been there for a while, but wanting to find an organic way to make that happen that didn't feel like I'm telling you rather than showing you. So really, there's a series of prints that I made a variety of years ago where I was using layers of text, but that were from family diaries, but in other languages. And so, so you could get the sort of visual patterning of the idea of text, but you might not be able to read it, either because you couldn't read the language or because it was layered under other layers of printmaking. So in quite a number of cases in prints and artist books, I've used sort of the idea of text as a visual texture, maybe as a pattern rather than as the words themselves. Again, being interested in handwriting for a long time. And so like for the visualization of these pandemic letters, there's no text on the wall, but it's an entirely text-based project. But I wanted to find a visual form in which to represent that. So, that was my hope with that. But then the taking care embroidery, yeah, you can see it's entirely text-based. But they're not my words. I'm sharing words from other people. So in this case, I'm using the text as much more, it's part of a larger kind of conceptual project of trying to care for words, to make the care visible from these acts of care that have been received by a variety of people. So for me, it made a lot of sense to use some of the text, being selective. Again, not telling the whole story for anybody, but yeah, I think that's a great question because I think there often can be a real tension between visual and written languages.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's done really successfully in your work, and I agree. Like, there's that, and I think it's visually appealing as well as kind of giving us just a little bit of what you're working on, and we can kind of start filling in the rest of the story as well.
Thanks.
Any final questions? I think we have gone through all of our chat questions. Did you have any final comments or thoughts, Rachel, before we wrap it up?
Let's see, the show is almost done, so I'll just say that I'll be in residence, like Gretchen mentioned, Thursday, Friday, Saturday this week. The show is still up on Sunday, but then that's the end of the road. So obviously you could see some photos here. If you want to come down, I will be adding some more of the embroideries tomorrow that I've stitched during the time, so there'll be a few more than what you've seen here. Yeah, if you want to come down, the gallery hours are 11 to 5, so I'll be in residence 1 to 5 on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then yeah, Sunday's open as well. So
we're actually closed on Sunday, this Sunday.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah. Just for holiday hours and I guess pandemic hours. So that's kind of playing in a little bit to what your ideas were with the residency, because I know we initially talked about like what does the residency look like when the museum is closed, dealing with all of these issues related to the pandemic. But yeah, I think that was great. Thank you so much, Rachel, for being here and doing this project. And again, if you have a letter for Rachel, you can, I would recommend just dropping it off with us at the Art Center. There's a mail slot on the door out on the outside of her gallery. You can even just slide it right through there off of Santa Fe. So yeah, thanks again. And hopefully we will see everyone again soon.
All right, thank you so much.